that proper procedures were not followed, precautionary principle was violated, existing guidelines are not adequate, and so new guidelines need to be developed. Amendments were filed, appeals filed, case is still ongoing. And I'll just move from there and go to further. Let's see. Okay. Here's the third case, Arna Rodriguez. That's Devendra Sharma, and that PVS, I couldn't get his full name, PV Satish, right, is the third guy. Arna Rodriguez, Devendra Sharma, and PV Satish, they're very, very strongly active in sort of the food movements. They filed a writ petition against the Government of India, Ministry of Environment and Forest, blah, 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 suggested that independent scientific panel, and they used many international and national scientists to suggest, to make this case, had raised concerns about GMOs. The government should develop a strict regulatory regime accordance to the Cartagena Protocol. Ban imports unless labeled GM-free. Interim application asking for labeling and for moratoriums. Case is still ongoing. All right, so these are the three cases, and I'll be ending pretty soon. So the Supreme Court judgments. Are they stalemate, losses, small victories? If we look at, because the cases are still ongoing, we may still think, and that because BT cotton was approved and adopted, that we may think that this has all been a loss, right? I mean, that civil society has been not very influential, that they have really not been able to have many victories, okay? But I think that if we look for sort of this grand victory narrative, I think we may be missing some very important small victories that I think are pretty critical. And I think, so the small victories that I talk about, and these are all ordered by the Supreme Court, by the way, and the state has had to follow them, right? Separation of RCGM and GEAC rules, so that circumvention, by saying we've gone to this one and not to the right, cannot be done again. The Supreme Court has ordered field trial of GMOs can only be conducted by the approval of the GEAC. So in the BT cotton case, where it was already released, because it had been approved by RCGM, even though GEAC had not approved it, should not, in the ideal situation, should not happen again, at least legally. Many of these PILs had suggested that the scientists are co-opted, and they had asked for independent scientists to be placed on the body of the GEAC. Two independent scientists, one suggested by the petitioners, PM Bhargava, by the way, who has raised all kinds of concerns with BT Brinjal, and that's why it came to public light. They were inducted into it. MS Swaminathan, for some of you who might know him, he was sort of the Green Revolution guy in India, but has taken a very much more, I would say, cautious stance on GM. So it was kind of surprising that both these people who have taken this very cautious stance, they haven't been totally opposed to it, but they have said we cannot have GM crops without testing. We need to have more data on all this before we move forward, okay? They have been inducted into the GEAC on, again, Supreme Court rulings. GEAC should verify before commercial release whether GMOs can create allergenicity and toxicity. Again, a Supreme Court ruling. GEAC should be transparent about the guidelines it uses. In fact, they have suggested that they should put it up on their website. What are the guidelines they are using for approval? Isolation distances should be increased between GM fields and non-GM fields. And the GEAC should actually examine, with the use of scientists of their own, of choosing by others, the level of detection of GM crops infiltrating into non-GM crops. They have also asked for the setting up of an autonomous expert committee, the National Center for Assessment of GMOs, and to develop a regulatory mechanism, okay? And I think I'm at my conclusion now, so let's see, yeah. Okay, so is it critical for the empowerment of civil society and the deepening of democracy? Is it a vehicle for political and judicial access for the disadvantaged? If we look at food sovereignty issues surrounding GMOs, by the way, because the term, they prefer to use the term food sovereignty, the opponents of GMOs, because they say the battle is about food sovereignty, it's not about security. because there's a loss of biodiversity, et cetera, right? And about our control over food sources. Many of them argue that even though it is not the best and it hasn't given us sort of the big bang victory that the activists wanted, yet it has been pretty critical, even with the small victories. Outside the sphere of civil society, particularly the legislative bodies and the state have accused the judiciary actually of judicial arrogance, and of sort of stepping over, of not sort of respecting the separation of powers, right? And clearly because the judiciary is directing them to do certain things, they're not very happy with that role. It's also led to sort of, backup in judiciary, because I mean, judiciary, there's so many court cases and PILs are just mounting up, and it's very difficult for the judiciary to take care of that. Does it create a hybrid space? And I've already talked about, is it Habermas's public sphere, or is it represented by Nancy Fraser's counter-publics? There's mixed result, especially actually when we compare it to the right to food movement, which it has been much more strong on, and I haven't gone into that because I didn't think I would have the time to do actually both. Judiciary is, so what are my conclusions? In terms of creating a counter space, I think the judiciary is much more willing to act when the epistemic community is not so divided. In the right to food movement, everyone agrees that people shouldn't go hungry, right? I mean, it is more willing to act on issues of transparency and accountability. As you see, much of the judgments by the Supreme Court have been related to issues of transparency and accountability. And the passage of the Right to Information Act, which is a very recent passage in India, it's only about 5 years old, that has enabled the judiciary to actually make these kind of transparency and accountability decisions. When it comes to values surrounding science, technology, or these larger values of modernity, right? They are much less willing to act that in a clear-cut way and say, well, this is wrong and here's our judgment. They take sort of these piecemeal kind of judgments, and they hope that, that they can sort of perhaps please both sides, okay? So that's kind of what I have found in much of my reading of this literature. And I want to end with Craig Calhoun's sort of quote here. And just the quote I've taken is, celebrating counterpublics is not enough, though. What matters is whether and to what extent an alternative shared public sphere is developed and is able to influence the state and its policies. In some ways, we clearly see just a little bit of the ability to influence state and policies, and this was evident through the moratorium that was placed on P.T. Brinjal. One of the actors that I did not list, and it's just as I was putting it together, the use of spiritual leaders. For the first time, there's this Ravi Shankar, who's the spiritual leader, and he has this huge TV sort of program. They used him to talk about GMOs and anti-GMOs. And actually his phrase was, he said, GMO fruits are sinful. I mean, those were the words he used. And he was very, very influential in convincing the consumers. And this pressure on the state has then led to the moratorium.